Okay, great. So the participant numbers are rapidly increasing. So if you just arrived, welcome to this talk on the ego of activism. I'm probably going to have to say that multiple times as people come in. I think there is over 400 people attending. So we'll see how many, with the nice sunny weather here in Europe, come up. Where are you, Charles, in the world?
I'm in Rhode Island, which is the east coast of the US.
Ah, nice. And is that home for you?
Well, my wife grew up here, so not really home for me. I mean, it is now, but it's not. I don't have deep roots here.
Okay. But are you there for lockdown? Is this where you're holed away?
Yeah,
Right.
this is where I'm being locked down.
And how is so yeah, I just want to give enough time for people to come. Rich, is it basically just does it automatically let people in now, or do you have to let them in chunks?
They're all arriving on their own by magic.
Great. Yeah, so someone was saying there's some dodgy links in the Facebook page. I've just left a note saying that under them that it's spam. So I'm hoping that will be clear. Great. Okay. So, I mean, shall we get started? Should we kick off?
Yeah,
Should
let's
we wait
get
for a couple
started.
of minutes?
People will pick it up.
Yeah, great. Okay, so welcome to the next 90 minutes. This is an interactive talk on what we've called the ego of activism. I'm Ronan Harrington, and we're here with Charles Eisenstein. So we're basically, I suppose it's an attempt to name what goes on under the surface of activism. I think in recent years, I suppose with polarization and with alienation from activism, this like critique of the social justice warrior, it's in the circles that I've been in, it's been an opportunity to essentially reflect and take a look at ourselves in the mirror. And rather than, it being an assumption, the reason we're not making change is because of the world out there. And for sure, there are many, many reasons, vested interests and powerful forces that make that the case. It's also based on understanding that, in any situation we're in a dynamic. And often a very powerful question is, what are we contributing to that dynamic? And what if we shifted the way we're contributing to that dynamic, might the whole dynamic change? And so that's, I think, what we're going to attempt to explore tonight. When I was thinking about how to talk about this event and how to kind of start a conversation about it, I posted on Facebook a list of aspects of the activist ego. And I think I managed to catalog maybe 20 or so. I'm sure there's many that I missed. And I'm actually just going to post them again, just so we can get a sense of them. So if you look in the chat, you'll see, this list. It was also on the event page on Facebook. And I suppose it was an attempt just to try and actually catalog and understand what are just some of the kind of what I would say are egoic tendencies. Because often when we're doing good in the world, or when we're fighting for a just cause, the rightness of that can obscure the method and potentially some subtle dynamics that are happening underneath. And so obviously there's obvious ones like maybe tribalism, and maybe cultural superiority. That's something that really came up in the wake of like Hillary and Trump. And we're very familiar with this conversation around, let's say, white fragility, and almost the defense of pathologizing activism. And we're familiar with privilege blindness. But then there's also this kind of subtle conversation about, okay, and what about privilege bashing? Where are the shadow dynamics coming from people who have been oppressed and are coming from that kind of oppressed place? What about, let's say, the potential for victimhood and even revenge expressing itself in activism? And kind of all the way through frenetic productivity, and poverty mindset. And I think at its heart, a lot of campaigns, if you kind of drill down underneath it, being driven by fear and insecurity, and that fear spilling over into, the words that we use and how we talk, and ultimately potentially not reaching that real potential for transformation where we can open people and inspire something new in themselves. So yeah, I think an interesting exercise is for us to reflect on some of this together. And when I was doing that, I was like, okay, well, I can't just put down this list and then say, this is the problem out there. And so they weren't numbered at the time, but I tried to identify, okay, where are these in me? And well, there's definitely a really strong belief that I'm right. And even though I kind of know, okay, the other side must have some valuable points, I still dismiss that. And there's a whole lot of cultural superiority and almost misanthropy for people who, don't live or act like me. That's often difficult to acknowledge. I didn't think I was fragile in the face of criticism. And then someone wrote a comment on the Facebook event saying, oh, great, 2 white men talking about how we as a diverse movement need to change. And I was so, unbelievably triggered. And rather than just kind of sitting with that and acknowledging that, I went immediately into the defense and saying, also there's a problem with the worldview that says white men shouldn't speak anywhere. And actually, it just ended in a mess, really. And so I suppose the intention with tonight is not to say, oh, well, once we're self-aware about these, that we have changed our behavior. There's a difference between awareness and virtue, and behavior change. But and even when we get to grips with it, it's a lifelong journey, and we're always kind of tripping over ourselves in this labyrinth. But it's still the start of a useful conversation. And so this also turned into a bit of a menu of shameful admissions. So I also want to maybe contextualize that when we talk about the ego of activism, we can tend to do what the often on the left does very well, which is be masochistic and negative and kind of tear itself apart. And actually, a good friend said to me, that at the heart of it, there is a egoic identity in activism that's very positive, which is that of the warrior that, let's say, puts on colors and paint and finds this energy to actually take to the streets and to challenge power, and to not forget that the ego has a very powerful, focused, directed energy. And so, the intention tonight is to speak about the ways in which we potentially perpetuate these things or struggle with them, rather than seeing it as a problem out there, and to also go underneath and to ask, what animates this? What are the wounds and the traumas that are common in activism? Where are the primal desires that we don't even acknowledge to ourselves, let alone others? But what is this thing? And I think that the hope is that with more conversations like this, it might give rise to a culture of activism that is cleaner. I think that a lot of people react to activism disdainfully. And as a part of that, because activism induces a cognitive dissonance, if you're telling people not to eat meat and they eat meat, that's a cognitive dissonance. Or if you're telling them not to fly and they fly, one answer is to change your behavior, and the other is actually to push back on them and say, well, they're X, Y, and Z. But also, I think that people detect an unintegrated shadow in activism, a kind of a shrillness that is put on them, and they're made to, basically adopt my worldview, think the way I think, or I'll label you ignorant, or I'll potentially label you racist or misogynist. And I think that even if the cause is right, people naturally react against that kind of perception of domination. And so there's a question about what might a form of activism that is still potent and powerful look like, that moves from this kind of subtle coercion to something that is modeling real freedom and activating people. And what would it mean for activists to see themselves as activators of this desire to change the world? So that's just by way of context. The format I think we'll go with is that Charles will speak for a bit and share his views, and we might do just a bit of an over and back to kind of get some steam on a conversation. And then we're going to open up the format for questions and take questions from you. And I think you can submit questions and vote on them. And really welcoming particularly views from people who don't share our background or our identities, so we can, within the constraints of this conversation, try and have a diversity of views. So Charles, I'll hand it over to you. See what you got to say.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ronan. That's a lot of grist for the mill. I could probably comment on all of those things in your list here. I'm looking at it right now, and maybe add some more items. Yeah. One of the things that just came up for me is activism as a form of escapism, where it sometimes happens that when we're faced with a horrible injustice in the world, that the discomfort of not knowing what to do about it is so intense that we default into some form of action that may not actually help. And maybe on some level we know that it isn't going to help, but the discomfort of not doing anything and the accusation of sitting around not doing anything and the discomfort from that, and the need to look to oneself or maybe to others as if you are doing something about it, that's so strong that it can push us into action when maybe the moment isn't for action. What moment isn't for action? It's when your actions are not taking you anywhere and that they're not actually helping. So that would be another thing maybe to add to the list. And I would maybe even elaborate on it a bit, that the default actions are very often not only not helpful, but they are part of the problem. We see this in the critique of the NGO industrial complex, where people are, organizations are going into wherever, Africa, thinking that they're helping, but actually in subtle ways, unrecognized to themselves, still operating from a colonialistic mindset, and in effect, spreading Western norms and values to other places, to other cultures, in the form of development or progress or improvement, as in, we know better than you how you should live, what you should value. And this isn't to say that cultures cannot and should not speak to each other and uplift each other. There are practices and values in the less, quote, developed world that really trouble me, such as female circumcision, which is very common in, like that. So I do think that there are ways that cultures can inform each other that we don't want to let go of. It's not everything from the dominant Western civilized culture is bad, but the fundamental mindset of we know better than you, we're more advanced, we're more developed than you, that is a problem. And that maybe relates to another thing you said. Here's two white guys telling us about activism. It's not that two white guys should never have public conversations. It's that if that's the only conversations that are being had, then what? And this is a key question, because it gets at why are we doing activism in the first place? Then what? Then we are shameful, then we are bad, then we are some label? Or is it then we are not actually fully serving most effectively what we really want to be here serving? I was on this was a while ago, I was invited to be on some panel, it was a prestigious thing. Like there were, everyone else in the panel was like, CEO of this, Nobel Prize of that, and they invited me to be on the panel. I'm like, the entire panel is all white men, I'm like, I don't think I really want to be in the panel. And the organizer was mortified. I was like, oh my God, I didn't even notice that. Thank you for taking a stand for equity, and I'm like, actually, I wasn't taking a stand for equity. I don't want Black people and women on the panel to be fair. This isn't about everybody gets a seat on the board of the world destroying machine. This is all white panels suck. All male panels tend to, not always, but they suck. Or really what I mean is that they're limited. Because what we need, the conversations that we need to have cannot happen just from within the worldview of the dominant culture, and especially of the privileged subset of the dominant culture. We reach a dead end that way. We hit a glass ceiling. The solutions that we can formulate from within the world assumptions of that mindset cannot solve the problem. We need information from the outside, information that might even seem offensive or irrational to those who are fully steeped in the Western system of knowledge production, school, academia, journalism. So I for me, it's not coming from a desire, at least this is what I strive for, okay? Not coming from a desire to confirm myself as one of the good guys, to confirm myself as a member of Team Good, fighting Team Evil, Team Justice, fighting Team Oppression, Team, inclusivity, battling Team Racism. Because if that is my motivation to confirm an image, then what I will achieve is precisely that, to confirm an image. And if that image is what's important to me, am I going to be open to criticism of where I might actually be causing harm? No, because I'm serving my image. That's going to harm my image. So I'm not going to be open to that. I would rather serve actual social and ecological healing, rather, and this is a question I've asked myself. I've even had a vision about it where I'm asked, okay, Charles, if you could, here's your instruction set to heal the world. Here's your magic feather, and I will give you this feather, and the world will heal if you agree to do as I say and use it correctly. And what you will have to sacrifice is that you will never get to be a hero, you will never be celebrated, and you will never even be vindicated. You will never, in the end, get to say, "Ha, see, I was right. They're wrong. Now they're wailing and gnashing their teeth," because they've been proven, finally, that climate change was real. It's been proven, finally, that whatever, fill in the blank. I'm never going to get that satisfaction. Why? Because I'm going to have to sacrifice something I thought I knew, that I held dearly, that I'd woven into my self-image. And the question is, are you willing to make that sacrifice? If you are truly serving, okay, I'll let you, I'm almost done. Yeah. I have more to say about the colonialist piece, but yeah, but just to finish the sentence, if you're truly serving a more beautiful world, then you're going to have to sacrifice service to other masters, like in-group acceptance, pride, vanity.
Yeah, that's this theme of sacrifice is super interesting, and I have a bit of a story about it. So yeah, last year I was coordinating the political strategy for Extinction Rebellion UK, coming up to the October Rebellion. And on one level, there was undoubtedly this just, I would say, I identify with that felt sense of just desperation and powerlessness, and that sense of I have to do something, and there is a wave happening in London, and I need to be a part of that. But it was very interesting to watch the power of my ego in every single step of the way, all the way through, and to almost try and dissect where it's coming from and why. One of the things that I was doing with Extinction Rebellion was I was a spokesperson, and the spokesperson's network, which is a kind of a WhatsApp group, and they take it in turns to speak on Channel 4 or whatever the nightly news is during the rebellion. It's full of like very gifted people who can shift the conversation. And it's also full of wounded narcissists who are desperate for the limelight. And I would say me chief among them. And it was so interesting to know in my heart of heart that Extinction Rebellion doesn't need another educated sounding white man as its spokesperson. Already has loads of them. If anything, to particularly connect with the British public, it needs someone who is from a working class background, isn't from a city, is from the regions, and speaks in a way that more people can identify with. And even though I knew that intellectually, that drive just to have that moment in the spotlight was so, so incredibly strong. And I started to try and investigate, okay, like where is this coming from? And I was doing therapy at the time. And I was unfortunate to lose my brother in a car accident when I was 4. He died outside of our house, and it's like rural Ireland in the 90s. And like my parents, my family, we don't have coping mechanisms or anything like that. So it was buried alongside him, you know? And my way of dealing with it was, there was a swing outside of our house. And I just basically after school just didn't go into the house because I just didn't feel like it was a good place to be. And instead just kind of swang and dreamt about this kind of future where I would be the star of my own narrative and I would bring about change. And that, and this is over years and years and years. So the imprinting of it was very, very strong. And I felt like throughout the whole rebellion, there was the really important work I was doing on political strategy and all of that. But there was also this personal psychodynamic issue that was attempting to be resolved. And I remember my therapist said to me, you know, you speak like this is your destiny, you know, to be this face and to speak. And actually the thing about trauma is that it will attract whatever it resonates with until it can be resolved. So what it's attracting is a shitload of anxiety and chaos of actually even putting yourself out there, the exposure, the vulnerability, being torn apart on social media. And all it's doing is activating that more and more. And at the time, you know, when we were thinking through the strategy, my big feeling was, okay, the April Rebellion was really about, okay, putting climate emergency on the agenda, not just sustainability or climate change awareness. It's an emergency. But that the October Rebellion had to be taking people on a journey from awareness to commitment, and that required sacrifice. And so we spoke a lot about this idea of, you know, the sacrifice the British public needs to make for us to make the transition. But what was interesting was what that sacrifice looked like to me at that level was to give up this opportunity for the limelight, this need for attention, and just how difficult it was, and still is, but how to resolve the actual energetic charge of that, I had to do some pretty strong self-inquiry. And, you know, I would still say I'm nowhere near there yet. And I share that because I think that many activists have their version of that, that there is some kind of unresolved wound that expresses itself through the activism and is seeking healing and resolution. And I'm curious to know what potentially that looks like for you in the past or even now, and just generally what you think about that.
I want to first say something about sacrifice. If you coerce somebody into giving something up, that's not a sacrifice. If you shame and guilt them into giving something up, that's not a sacrifice. And the way that the movement is asking the public to make sacrifices, you're not actually inviting a sacrifice. A sacrifice is something that you give up for a sacred purpose, that is sacred to you. It's a voluntary act. The way to induce people to make sacrifices is to connect them with the sacred, which could be the beauty of a living earth. But if you're not making that connection, and instead you're simply in some coded way exerting dominating force over them, you're not actually inviting a sacrifice. You are taking something, and they will sense that and resist you. So that, I think, is one reason why Extinction Rebellion has generated so much counter-reaction, including like bringing up class issues, because the sacrifices, I mean, we're seeing now with COVID as well, like the quote sacrifices, like, you know, for the more affluent people, lockdown has been an inconvenience. For working class people, it has been a catastrophe for a lot of them, not at all. But I mean, I know people, you know, who are, you know, they've lost their job. They have no money. Children are going hungry, millions of them. But I also want to actually, before I circle back to your question, I want to say that the view of that the privileged are merely being inconvenienced by this is itself also an expression of privilege that orders orders suffering in certain ways, and that doesn't recognize, ultimately doesn't recognize that the privileged are equally the victims of our system, just in different ways. But if somebody is so miserable that they have to take depression medication, or that they attempt suicide, which is an affliction from which the upper classes are not exempt, depression, suicide, addiction. If someone is that miserable, then you cannot say that the system is even working for them. So it's only a value system that holds material wealth and the upper and middle class lifestyle as the goal of humanity that should be carried forth and imposed on every place on earth. That value system, that itself is a construct of our own system. Anyway, so this whole thing about, yes, so what is the trauma that, because it's not like we're just bad, humans are bad and we have to conquer this nasty thing called ego. That in itself is a demand for a sacrifice that then becomes not a sacrifice. So this is a really important, I hope I'm not being too abstract here, but it's an important inquiry to ask, what is the source of the behavior that I'm labeling as egotistical? And so what was your brother's name?
Mark.
Mark. Yeah. And how old was he?
He was 9.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just want to pause actually in honor of him and the soul's journey that you know, it catalyzed trauma, but trauma is actually how also how we grow and how we become strong. There's and this is something that's unpopular to say among activists, but I'm going to say it anyway, because it is an example of the excluded views that we need to let in. So you could react to it as, you know, by labeling it the opiate of the masses, but the idea that there's a larger intelligence at work here that deputes people like Mark to intervene in the flow of affairs, to provide the initiations that are necessary for us to become strong warriors. Like, there's an intelligence at work here, and some of the brave souls volunteer to be recruited and placed in hard circumstances where they're doing the important work that is never celebrated, never rewarded, not by the system and not even by the community of activists. You know, it doesn't take that much character, it doesn't take that much strength of character for me to do my work. You know, like, I make speeches and things like that, and everyone's telling me how wonderful I am and how important my work is. So my ego gets cookies all the time. It gets a steady diet of yes, Charles, you're a good person. Yes, Charles, we love you. Well, what about the woman working at a daycare center and going the extra mile to really give those little babies real care, real affection, extra hugs, even when they test her patience? There she is, being a saint, and they never even remember her when they grow up, but they got a big dose of love in that daycare center, and she gets paid minimum wage. No one is hailing her as a hero. But on some level, I think everyone recognizes that these people are having an impact on the world. We may not be able to easily trace it, but one of those kids who grows up and has benefited from that infusion of love, who knows what that kid would do if he hadn't had that? Who knows if that kid could be a great leader someday because he had a little less trauma. He had, I mean, we can handle trauma if we also have love. Trauma is not something that you can overcome by yourself, and you can't learn self-love by trying harder to do it. Really, what motivates, and this answers the question too, like, what motivates this compulsion to seek affirmation, to seek approval, to demonstrate one's acceptability and lovability and goodness? It comes from a wound of rejection. It comes from an experience of not belonging, of conditional approval and punishment, of shaming. This infuses school, religion, parenting. It's even in science, the selfish gene, the biological program to maximize self-interest. So this message and this experience pervades modern society. So most people who grew up in modern society carry this wound of self-rejection. And to overcome that, you know, the antidote to that is those experiences we've had of being unconditionally loved and of belonging and of being accepted and of being part of the world. So that experience of separation, that also leads to an attempt to dominate and control the world. If you don't belong to the world, if the world is hostile, if you are insecure, because real security comes through belonging and connection, comes through the experience of being loved, growing up in a hunter-gatherer tribe or a indigenous village somewhere, where your entire childhood, your entire life, you know intimately all the faces around you, and not just the human faces, but the faces of the land. You know who you are, and everybody knows you. You're in a web of relationship, and therefore you feel secure. So without that sense of belonging, we seek to, and this is, I'm sorry if this is getting really psychological, but we seek to construct a belonging. And that leads to some of the things on your list, like tribalism and these in-group, out-group dynamics. And so what I'm saying is that this pathology that you're identifying in activism is the same pathology that drives our civilization to conquer and control the whole planet. It's the same wound in different form. And that is how activism gets enrolled in the maintenance of the world-destroying machine. As long as it's coming from that same psychology, it will bear the same results. And in fact, it's necessary to have, like they call it, a controlled opposition. Or in Orwell in 1984, he identifies that there has to be an opposition. There has to be this rebellious brotherhood in order, and that in fact is a secret organ of the party itself. So how do you as an activist stop being a secret organ of the party itself? That's what I'm getting at.
So I hear that. And then also many activists who are opposing would say that we're doing our best to ensure that the line of injustice stops here. And if we didn't exist, it would go much further. You know, there are many harmful forces in our culture and in our politics that require, and this is my assumption, an opposition just to hold the line. So where do we get this balance between harm prevention and entering into a dynamic that sustains a bad formula, as you might say? A really nice analogy for polarization is this idea that you're in a canoe, and someone reaches out to one side, and the boat sways this way, and the only way to correct the balance of the boat is for the other person to swing out this way, and all of a sudden you have two people at the furthest edges of the boat, at the very extremes, trying to keep the boat in the center. And if you spoke to both of them, they would say, well, I have to be at this extreme because they're being so extreme. And if I didn't exist, then we'd be railroaded, or people would be railroaded. So how do we exit a polarized dynamic while it's happening, and protect, you know, the kind of issues that we seek to serve?
Yeah, absolutely. There are like flagrant injustices in the world that we just need to take a stand and enter the fight and protect the innocent and so forth. But we have to make sure that the way that we're doing that doesn't actually contribute to the conditions that generate the problem to begin with. I just saw Jeff Gibbs, Michael Moore's film, Planet of the Humans, where it's a good example of this. Have you seen the film?
No.
Okay, so basically Gibbs is an environmentalist. He is enamored of clean energy, and then he starts to discover the dark underbelly of so-called clean energy, all the mining and ecocide that's necessary to make these solar panels and these wind turbines that don't even actually contribute that much more energy, if any, than they use in their manufacture, and like they break down after 20 years, and there's like all these toxic chemicals involved, and not to mention biofuels, which is at least industrial scale biofuels is just an ecological catastrophe, and it's all being done in the name of clean energy. So on one level, this is a result of thinking that you know what the answer is, framing the problem in terms of carbon metrics that render invisible all that is not included in the metrics, in the same way that GDP, as a yardstick for progress, renders invisible all of the cultural values that cannot be measured in money and that get sacrificed to money through World Bank development programs. Okay, so the same process of rendering invisible happens when you reduce environmentalism to carbon and then pursue solutions based on that, thinking that you're doing something, thinking that, well, we have to do something because the planet it's an emergency, so let's do something. So that's on one level, but also in the film, then what does the filmmaker blame for this problem? So this is a classic initiation process. The world falls apart, like clean green energy. it was going to save us, and that is in shreds. And there you are standing bewildered, betrayed, in this uncomfortable space of vertigo. I mean, if your identity was wrapped up in that, what do I do now? Who am I right now? So there's this escape valve from that state, which actually is a sacred state and a generative state. But there's an escape valve, which is find somebody to blame, find that bad thing. And so then the film turns toward the, corporate ties of big environmental NGOs, and he implies that there are these financial interests that have taken over the environmental movement, and like he's identified a bad guy now. But that solution template of find the bad guy is on a deeper level actually part of the problem. It originates in the mentality of conquest that goes back thousands of years to the origin of civilization, where the first idea of evil arose, and it was associated with the wild. And the king, who personified good, was the slayer of the lions, the conqueror of the barbarians, bringing domesticating the beasts, cutting down the forest, draining the wetlands, extending civilization. That was good. And the wild was evil. So that mentality of conquest has become like this deep DNA of our civilization that infuses activism just as much as everything else. And so it steers us toward identify the enemy, find something to conquer, find something to kill. So I'm not saying that we should therefore not do anything, that we should therefore not take a stand against injustice, but let's move to a deeper level than identifying the problem, the cause, as some bad people. That is a trap. And it's the same mentality as identifying the cause of crime as these bad criminals. It allows you to ignore the causes, the deeper causes. Like, why would somebody become a criminal? Well, it has to do with poverty, it has to do with trauma, it has to do with racism, it has to do with a set of conditions, it has to do with capitalism. And if we blame bad people, we never even see that. We have to be careful not to fall into that trap with our diagnose, like just to turn that same mindset against the oppressors without that is strengthening the mindset that is the cause of the problem, and to turn it against ourselves also doesn't lead anywhere. It might make you feel better if you go through a rigorous interrogation and confession. In Maoist China, it was called a criticism and struggle session, where you confess to your privilege and your racism, and then you get absolution, you get forgiveness. By beating up on yourself, then you gain acceptance. But does that actually change anything? So I'm asking for a deeper level of revolution here. It's not about white people getting off the hook. It's about actually changing the conditions that endlessly give birth to different kinds of oppression. Dehumanization.
So I think it's interesting then to, can you just say again the name of the interrogation in Maoist China?
Yeah, criticism and struggle.
Criticism and struggle.
PDO, yeah.
And so
right.
it mirrors, and I'm aware that this is a very sensitive thing for a white person to say, but it mirrors dynamics that I see in decolonial political movements, in movements that are attempting to address racial injustice, where there's an analysis that white people are perpetuating a system of oppression, either through ignorance or by not advancing a person of color agenda. And I feel that's very real. Like, if we look at the numbers that are dying in COVID, if we look at who's going to be affected in climate change, Vinay Gupta, a activist, wrote a piece that was saying, at the moment we have a situation where in 10 to 15 years in India, you could face the prospects of 30 to 50 million people dying. And we have a situation where white Americans are basically maintaining a carbon budget that's way beyond their means by driving SUVs and maintaining air conditioning all year round. And that is, in one sense, systemic genocide from, white people towards brown people. And so there's very real issues where there seems to be a group of people that are engaging in really problematic behavior, and there's another group of people who are suffering deeply because of it. And so that's the context. Now, at the moment, the dynamics of, let's say, anti-racist movements mirrors that kind of Maoist China idea. Well, white people have to atone for their sin, their original sin, in this case being privilege. They have to kind of deplatform themselves. They have to join the movement, stay quiet, listen, be humble. And yet there is seems to be a kind of a backlash against that, because there's no end to the kowtowing. And at the same time, so when you speak about this, this need for something more transformational, and I'm wondering, going from the abstract to something specific, what does it look like in anti-racism movements or in climate justice? How do you, let's say, bring white majorities towards an understanding of what they are doing, in ways that will actually bring about change? And clearly, blaming and shaming them doesn't work, but there's also it would be pretty valid to feel like they're worthy of blame or being made to feel guilty about what they do.
If you didn't change the system, and merely inserted Black and brown people in the roles that white people have today, nothing is going to change on Earth. If you live where I live, you literally cannot live without driving cars. The mindset that I think that we need to adopt is, I just turn it into a mantra, which is, what is it like to be you? If you want to fight racism, then you have to ask, what is it like to be a racist? Rather than warring against your projection of what a racist is, this caricaturization of a racist. Like, what is it actually like to be one of them? What are the conditions from which racism arises? The cultural conditions, the personal conditions. If you understand that, then you can change the conditions. If you're serious about ending racism and don't want merely to come off as this social justice warrior and one of the good guys, but you actually want to change racism, then you have to ask, what is it like to be you? This, in fact, on another level, the refusal to stand in another person's shoes is the foundation of racism. It is, because racism is dehumanization. It's to make somebody into a caricature of a full human being, to make them less than a full human being. If you want to combat racism, if you want to change racism, you have to act from the place of, we are all full human beings. And if you are causing harm, then to ask, why are you doing that? Not in the shaming sense of like when your mother says, why did you do that? Which is basically, you're inexcusable, but to say, really, like, why? And maybe you're not asking that face to face, but that's the mentality that you carry. So that, why? So that you can let them off the hook, because after all, you understood that it was their trauma or their whatever. No, it's because you actually want to change the situation. And that prevents us from mistaking punishment for justice. When I hear like, oh, we have to hold them accountable. Okay, what does that mean? If we are moving beyond punishment, and again, like this, I mean, you can see how this mindset of punishment, confusing punishment with justice, has devastated communities of color in the developed world. That's what's ravaged the inner cities of the US, for example. But to move beyond punishment as justice or accountability as punishment, then you get into, well, it's an open question. I have my thoughts on it. It has to do with transparency. It has to do with making the truth visible, having social mechanisms where people cannot engage in harmful behavior and not be seen doing it. And I think that some of the ways to heal racism have been developed to a high degree in Africa. This is one of the hotbeds of the technologies of healing that some in the West, some activists in the West are learning from these, but from the Truth and Reconciliation Committees, for example, in South Africa, in Rwanda, they are pioneering the technology of forgiveness, which fundamentally, I can say a lot about it. Forgiveness is a form of sacrifice because you're sacrificing revenge. You're sacrificing, like if somebody has wronged you, then that can be an opportunity to dominate them, to hold them guilty. To sacrifice that prevents the oppression dynamics from merely flipping. That's not what we want, is it? Even like I'm a white person saying this, but I mean, I have, friends who and allies in the movement who they're like, yeah, we don't want to just flip the roles and become the new oppressors. What we are fighting is not the white people, we're fighting racism. We don't want a world with racism. And in the US, like a lot of times it seems that fairness or equality just means that, Black people and women and gay people get to be on the, Joint Chiefs of Staff and get to operate the drones, and get to operate the extractive machinery of capitalism, which requires there to be an underclass. It is no improvement on this planet if the underclass becomes white instead of Black. What we would like is a world without an underclass, without inequality, like that. And yeah, I just think that, well, okay, maybe I'll leave it at that for now, because we did want to move on to.
Yeah, so we're going to open up now to questions. Rich, is there any, do you want to come out from hiding and explain what's going on with the Q&A, or is it just obvious to everyone?
Hi, I'm a human being. I'm learning how to use Zoom webinars, and there should be a button on your screen if you're on a laptop at the bottom of the screen called Q&A, and if you're on a phone, I think you may have to tap the screen to see the button that says Q&A. And if you can put your best questions in there, and you can also upvote each other's questions so we can get a sorted list of what might be most interesting. And hopefully both of you panelists can see that list and respond to it at your leisure.
Great. Thanks, Rich. Okay, there's two things I want to pick up on. I mean, like, I agree in principle with it's almost like, what's the intention with the activism? Are we seeing people as full human beings? Are we really empathizing? Asking that question, what is it like to be you? Going from punishment to holding people accountable and addressing the conditions. But activism, my feeling is that it's actually historic events that shape the conditions. No activist campaign could get the whole world to stay indoors for 8 weeks and to pause and for capitalism to stop. That took a virus. And activism in the kind of the everyday world of politics is in campaign mode, and it's trying to simplify complex issues like, okay, who are the top 5 fossil fuel companies that we need to draw attention to in the hope that in curbing their activity that might have a spillover effect for the entire industry, and that we mightn't be as zealous with our enemy narrative, but we will be identifying them as being the problem. And similarly wondering, what does that look like with let's say a population as a whole, if it's recreating a culture of racism? because obviously the conditions that create racism, that work to address them is, a 300-year struggle. That's a really long time span. And obviously that work just has to be done, that kind of transformational groundswell. But in the meantime, and maybe this is a problem, but the business of activism is in movements that move the dial, and they pick particular issues that they try and get the public to care about. And in your advocacy for a new activism, what is left for that kind of regular activist game? How does it look different potentially? Have you seen any examples or any leaders that you feel are, worth looking at and following?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the expert to ask here. I think that, and we could go from, issue to issue to issue. I think with racism, one of the most potent methods to change the ground conditions is the sharing of stories. So here in the US, one of the main forms that racism takes is anti-immigration sentiment, where right-wing websites, they're full of all of these stereotypes about immigrants, and I'm like, if you guys could actually talk to an immigrant and they're like, well, they're coming here because they've messed up their own countries and they want to take advantage of our freedoms and our good economy, and I'm like, if you know what it was like to be in such a desperate condition that you leave your children in order to go to a strange country at great danger to yourself with no guarantee of success, just to send a little bit of money back while your parents raise your kids, and to be not see your kids for years, or like, I mean, the stories that come up when you allow them, they explode any racist stereotype that you hold. So for me, the question is, how do you get people to actually hear each other's stories, to actually put themselves in each other's shoes, rather than assaulting with data, with statistics, with studies, their beliefs? That doesn't work. So this kind of activism, people are actually doing this kind of thing. I was, a friend of mine was working, this is a few years ago, with people in Ferguson, Missouri, when they were, protesting the police violence against Black people, and she was like, okay, we're going to try this. And I don't remember the story exactly, but it involved like a Black grandmother, just one-on-one with a cop, just telling him about her anxiety every day that her grandchild wasn't going to make it home that day. And like tears came to his eyes, that kind of, I think we have to go down to that level, to the grassroots level, to counteract because the way that our institutions the way that our institutions are maintained is through narratives and the deeper mythologies upon which those narratives rest. So any way that we can introduce data points that don't fit the narrative is revolutionary. And those data points can be on the feeling level. It becomes harder to maintain. There's that story of, what was that guy? He gave a TED talk on it. A Black musician who befriended a Ku Klux Klan grand wizard, a state leader, and they just had a frank exchange of ideas. And the Ku Klux Klan leader was like, yeah, I do think I'm superior to you. And the guy was like, oh, well, that's interesting. Here's what life is like on my end. And in the end, he wasn't trying to change his mind, but in the end, the guy quit the Klan, gave up his robes, because his worldview could not hold in the face of the truth. Ultimately, what will save us is the truth. How do you create conditions for somebody to receive the truth? That's the question. And why do we resist the truth? One reason we resist it is if the truth challenges our self-image and our existing story of the world that includes oneself as a good guy and a hero. So if you look back in your life, like when you've admitted you were wrong and that was humiliating, what made you able to do that? What makes you willing to do that? What makes you feel safe to do that? Is it if you're surrounded by enemies who are trying to get you? Or is it if you're surrounded by people who want what's best for you too, who include you in the human family, who are loving you?
And it just raises it seems so obvious, but it's invisible, is that what we're asking people is to make a shift in their identity, in their heart, in how they think and how they feel. And that requires psychological safety. And politics is probably the most psychologically unsafe terrain there is. It's defined by defensiveness and fear of exposure. And so it's just profoundly unsafe.
It is.
I would just,
yeah.
It's just
I put stuff out there,
unsafe.
People say the horrible things about me, and I'm like, okay, there might be something there, but come on, I'm not like that bad, like people have said I'm the Antichrist, I'm like, maybe I'm not right about everything, but Antichrist, I mean.
You're the new age Jesus Christ, Charles, come on.
Yeah. Anyway, should we look at the questions here?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so we go by straight up democracy, who the top vote. I clicked down slides. So this question is from Jade Shi. It sounds like we need transformational individual change in order to move towards sustainable social and climate justice. How do we approach this on a collective level, Charles? Do you believe this is at all possible to achieve in this generation?
No, it's not impossible. Well, this depends what you mean by achieve it. I mean, the world that we live in today has developed over many thousands of years. I think that we can, and I just look at the situation we have. I'm like, we have a long way to go. People who are radical in one aspect are reflexively, unconsciously orthodox in other dimensions. There's a long way to go yet. Even in one generation, we could experience profound healing. But no, this is not going to happen in one generation. And also, I want to say, like, in response to that, let me look at it again. Q&A. Yeah, how do we approach this on a collective level? And I think it is through the propagation of stories, of narratives, of frames of reference that support that kind of personal change and that give us ways to channel that change into political action, into systems change. So it's, yeah, I'm not one of the people saying, oh, be the change you want to see and the change is all within and then the world outside will magically transform in alignment with that change. It's more like as we go through personal changes, who we are as an activist changes too. And we have access to technologies of change that had not been available before. And things like restorative justice circles, you asked for an example, like that's, Dominic Barter, who's pioneered this in Brazil. These become, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. Whereas if you haven't done that kind of work and healed that trauma, then punishment as justice seems so obvious. Like it's all you know. It's only when you have that encounter with a criminal, maybe through one of these storytelling programs. There's some in the US, Snap Judgment is one. I mean, there's some where prisoners are telling their stories, you know, and then like, or you go to prison. Some of the politicians in the US who are working for prison reform, they had gone to prison, you know, because they were corrupt, they did something bad, you know, and they went to prison, and then they were like, whoa, this system is inhumane, and the people in the prison, these aren't evil people, you know. So yeah, there's no formula here, but I just did want to point out the interrelationship between the personal and the political.
Yeah, and also I think that there's an assumption in the question, which is that there's some kind of DNA of a right way of being that's easier to achieve at an individual and a small group level, and it's how do we scale that? But I think that we're now moving into the century, I would say, of collective experiences, where we experience the collective breakdown of a system. We're seeing a mini kind of dress rehearsal of it with COVID, where you know, most of the population are going through some kind of collective experience of vulnerability, a sense of their you know, interdependence, confrontation with parental mortality. So there is also a collective initiation, and it speaks to something you said at the beginning, which I want to circle back to, which was, you know, often the most radical and difficult thing to do is to do nothing, and is to trust that there is an intelligence in life, in this system, that is working its way out. I really like Vanessa Andorotti from the Decolonial Futures Collective in Canada, where she talks about, rather than the colonial mindset of analyze and act to change something, whether that be for bad or for good, we allow life to metabolize itself through us. And there's a lot of shit layered on top of life. And what life will do is it will metabolize through that in its own time. And if we don't deny that process, but actually allow us to be instruments of that, it will change of its own accord. And it's a different kind of logic where, you know, surrendering to spirit can be quite, you know, vague and difficult to apprehend. But I think maybe many of us notice the difference between acting on egoic impulse, fear, reactivity, and really being still and being moved, and somehow that being the right move that gives rise to the kind of outcome that we're seeking. I'm just mindful that there are many questions coming up, and I want to be able to get to a number of them before. But do you have a quick response?
Yeah, I can be quick with that and then segue into Sarah's question.
Yeah, great.
So like you could ask, okay, so this mindset you're talking about, okay, here's the problem, we're going to analyze it, we're going to make a plan, and we're going to compartmentalize that plan, and you do this and they do that, and here's like, that is a colonial or imperial mindset. And why? What is it about that is so colonial? It comes fundamentally from a worldview, a mythology, in which human beings are the only full subjects in the universe, that the world outside of ourselves does not possess intelligence, consciousness, purpose, or its own directionality toward order and toward life. Therefore, it is up to human beings to make things happen, to impose a plan onto a world that fundamentally has none. But if you understand that there is intelligence inherent in the world outside of humanity, which does not mean imposed upon it by an external God, but that is immanent in reality, in nature, that the world is full of beings, it's bursting with beings, and that it is a being, then your only option is no longer to impose order onto a world that has none, because there's an emergent order that we can participate in, or maybe several possibilities of emergent orders that we could participate in. So our role then, and our greatest effectiveness, is no longer as the dominators and the imposers, but it starts with listening, recognizing what possibilities are available and to which we want to bow into service, to co-create that possibility. So it's not inaction and just letting it happen, but it's not dominating either. It's participatory. And that is the mindset, and that is consistent with the beliefs of every indigenous culture that I know about. I don't want to generalize, but that seems to be what unifies every indigenous worldview, that we're not the only beings here. and not the superior beings, not the best, not the most highly developed. But we are part of a very, very large family. And so that to look at Sarah's question then, which is a bit related, do you think it is necessary to overtly instrumentalize spirituality, spiritual practices, and spirit to bring about the changes that we need to survive? Does a new vision of theocracy have value in this moment? So, you know, I mean, it depends, of course, on what we mean by spirituality or the spirit. Often spirit or spirituality becomes a way actually to push off, to exclude, by pushing off into a non-material realm, those aspects of materiality that get in the way of commodity production and extraction. Because if you make the sacred something non-material, i.e. spiritual, then there's no limit to what we do to the material because it's not sacred. So I think that, so it depends what we mean by spiritual, but I do say, yeah, we have to bring in aspects of reality that have been excluded. And those can be derided as, oh, New Age, oh, spirituality. I mean, to talk about the beingness of a mountain or a river or a forest beyond its use value. Some people would say, well, that's New Agey and that's spiritual. But I think that's actually an expanded materiality. So I do think that there, as this question implies, there is a danger in reifying spirituality as a separate category. But, and so that's why I take that impulse, which really, it means the spiritual impulse arises from a recognition that we are leaving something out. We as the dominant culture, supposedly dominant culture at least, that we are leaving something really important about reality out. That is the motivating impulse of spirituality in the West, or the sacred impulse behind spirituality in the West. And I really want to validate that and say, yeah, we are leaving something out, and the world and matter is so much more than we have given it credit for. And gosh, I mean, I can even apply this to COVID and stuff, but let me halt there. And
well, I just want to come in that I think that, you know, many people on this call, I think many people even in activist circles now have a personal relationship with spirituality. It's, you know, at least kind of mainstream in our subculture of activism and social change. But I think one of the big barriers where it does need to be instrumentalized is that we lack a language and a structure to commune with spirit collectively. There's almost a kind of a hangover, an embarrassment. The philosopher John Keats said that the Enlightenment will have succeeded when a man found praying on his knees would get up embarrassed. And we have that sense that we all have our, you know, a place in nature that we go to, or we say our morning prayers or whatever it might be. But once we step into a professional context, you know, even in Extinction Rebellion, which was a very spiritual organization, it was a high level of, you know, developmental culture and thinking. There would still be a kind of an invisible barrier to pass. And probably the person inviting it would have to have a lot of kind of cultural cachet to be able to say, can we just take a moment to pause? Can we listen together? Can we even pray together? And that it feels like there's a correlation between spiritual depth and interpersonal trust that can only really be done in small groups. But I think that whatever that piece of work is a crucial part of spirituality really flowing in activism. Because at the moment, activism is still operating from, you can call it, you know, colonial frames of like reasoning, and because of that reasoning and that separation, fear and anxiety, and then it's abstract, solve the problem, what do we do, react to this, react to that. Whereas the activists that I really respect, the elders that I really respect, move at a slower pace. they're grounded, they're centered, they listen, they take time for their practice, and they emanate some kind of presence that speaks for itself. And I think that when a movement can harness that kind of energy, it won't need to say very much. It won't need much, impressive data and narratives. It will simply wash over society. And I think, I'm in a lot of conversations about what does the next Extinction Rebellion look like. I don't literally mean the next climate movement, but the next kind of coming together in a mass way. And how can we amplify, or how do we collectively get out of the way so spirit can really show up and wash over society and do the talking for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wrote an essay last year called Every Act a Ceremony, which is about the recovery of a spirituality that doesn't, that has integrated the failure of our legacy spirituality of Christianity, and that doesn't just try to replace it with some imported spirituality, which ends up being a cultural appropriation, but that actually goes back to first principles that have to do with precision and attentiveness. That we have to go back to first principles to recover an authentic spirituality, rather than importing a native person to invoke the four directions before we do our climate march or something like that. To try to graft that on is unsatisfying. It feels fake,
Yeah, and I think that's why, art and participatory art and music can often allow us to approach it indirectly. We contact some of the same spirit without necessarily, going in a direct way. I have a question from Dahlia, which is, who are the people, at least one, other than white male, behind the scenes, alongside your path, that has enabled you to be here?
I mean, I could name some of my deep allies.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, take your time. Like, that's a big question, and, let's try and give it space.
I would say, in terms of enabled me to be here, there are key people who basically remind me that I'm not crazy. And these people are both white and non-white. And the non-white ones can be very important to me because, I got to make sure that it's really helpful to have somebody from a profoundly different background who can see blind spots that I can't see. And also, if I'm saying something that is so alien to and outside my own culture, then my allies pretty much have to come from outside my culture. So I have around the world people I consider my deep allies. Some of them are, public figures, and some of them are not. And I'm not even sure if they would want to be named. But sometime this year, I'm going to be putting out a recording of a conversation that I filmed with someone who's a deep ally, Orland Bishop, who's he can't find that much of his stuff online, although I recorded some podcasts with him earlier in the last few years. He's originally from Guyana and moved to LA. He's of African descent and spent a couple decades doing gang peacemaking in LA and brokered a peace between the Crips and the Bloods. And he's, you wouldn't think he's a very esoteric person. He's like really, engaged, but also a profound mystic, deeply steeped in Western esoteric traditions as well as African spirituality. So that's somebody, I have some podcasts with him. Another deep ally is Bayo Komolafe. If you have an opportunity to look into his work, a fantastic writer and speaker, and deep thinker and dear friend, and Pat McCabe, a Navajo Dene woman. I also have a deep connection with, and yeah, these are some of the people that help remind me that I'm not crazy and help keep me sane. And I could name other ones, but it's kind of yeah, it's kind of a private thing.
Yeah, and
yeah,
maybe
these are not people that necessarily want to be made a big deal of,
yeah,
especially Orland. So I'm really, I hesitated to speak his name, but I do appreciate the invitation, and really want to speak my deep respect for that man.
Let's take a moment just to honor him. It makes me think about that this, that there is the activist, and there are all the people that continually support them to keep showing up and to find courage. And actually, Rich, who's helping us tonight, has an interesting framework called micro-solidarity. And it's basically, how do small groups come together and emotionally support each other? And that rather than seeing courage as this, great, valiant individual attribute, it's a relational process. I sit with my dear friends who understand me and know me and are there at the end of a phone when I get abused online, and they'll keep on encouraging me. And that encouragement is relational. It's never mine. It's given to me by my nearest and my dearest. And yeah, I'm not going to go into my particular people, but many of them are actually on this call. And I went into this call with a lot of fear because I got involved and entangled in quite a difficult comment off around, you're platforming yourself, you're a white man, you shouldn't be doing it. And I felt so much fear and anxiety, but was grounded by friends being like, we're going to be here with you, and we love you. And there might be some people here who have the knives out, and also we're here, and I think that, it goes back to something that you said at the beginning. It's, who are all the invisible activists who come in and they play their part in ways that allow other people that are more visible to do the work that they do, and never are known and never need to be known or even want to be known. So yeah, I just want to celebrate them. Okay, so we're coming towards the end of our time. There's a lot of questions here. It's quite hard to keep the conversation going and read through them at the same time. But I just want to take a moment just to read through them, and also people can take a moment just in case there's any last voting that might help us.
Maybe can I just take a look at them, and maybe I'll just pick one or two out for a really quick thing.
Sure.
Do you think the impulse behind activism will ever be satisfied? Yeah, so there's all of these impulses, but then there's also the true impulse, the soul impulse. And it will never be satisfied, because that impulse is to take the next step toward the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And that next step always emerges, no matter how beautiful the world becomes, that beauty gives birth to the next possibility. So the impulse to serve life, that's really what activism is fundamentally. Outside of all of the ego of activism, it's the impulse to serve life, which is why we are here. That's why Gaia produced us, to serve the further coming alive of Gaia. That's why every species is here, actually. Each species plays a role in maintaining and evolving the whole. We're the same. And when we align with that, then we will step into our purpose here as a species. So yeah, never be satisfied, and that's good.
I just want to say that, yeah, so much of activism is defined by all that needs to be opposed, all that is wrong in the world, but actually returning to that idea that that opposition is life when we're being true to it, opposing it and saying, this is not just, this is not right. And when those are corrected, it goes on to creating more of what life wants, more expansion, more possibility. And, you know, I think that activism, when it succeeds, becomes actually the self-organizing principle by which society organizes. You know, like it's a vision of a future where we are in deep listening together of how we serve and how we share a gift. Obviously, it's something you've spoken about since the beginning of your time, you know, contributing to the space. It's just back to the original vision of being in service to something that really speaks to your heart and sharing your gift. And that almost that is the compass that helps us navigate the labyrinth of the ego, which can kind of, you know, either on an individual or on a cultural level, come in and sabotage us and get us embroiled in all of these oppositional dynamics. But there's a kind of there's a purity or a simplicity at the heart of it that comes when we're in a connected space.
Thank you. Looking to the next question, if I can just breeze through. What is the role of, oh, now what happened to it? There it is. Psychotechnologies, psychedelics, meditation, and how do we avoid them becoming a distraction, demotivating? I mean, for me, they've been instrumental in showing me and confirming my sneaking suspicion that there's something I haven't been told here about the world and about reality and about who I am. LSD confirmed that for me, you know, when I was 22 years old, and I've got repeated help from these medicines throughout my life at key moments, and through some of the other spiritual technologies as well. So they show us something, but they can't do it for us. So that way, if we are sourcing that future from, or we are sourcing that possibility from these substances, that's actually abusing them. They're not meant to do it for us. They're meant to show us what's possible, to show us something that we can work toward. They can fly us to a place, but eventually we have to walk there. But at least we've seen it and we know it exists, and it confirms that sneaking suspicion. So that's how it is for me. Gosh, I think we are running out of time, but I don't know, Ronan, did you want to just, because there's, wow, there are tons of these questions. Yeah.
There's tons of these questions, but we don't got a ton of time. We're over, and I just want to, yeah, like respect your time and everyone else's. So maybe we'll just kind of give just some space just for some reflections on this conversation that we've had, and anything that you're taking away from it, or anything that you feel is important to say again or in a different way.
I would just offer, you know, maybe some of what I've said is triggering or validating, or both. And I would just invite not to jump too quickly to a conclusion, not to jump too quickly into trying to fit this into an existing conceptual category of who Charles is and what narrative he is representing in your existing pantheon. But to embrace, as Bayo Komolafe says, you know, to embrace the mangle, to spend some time in the bewilderment, and let things coalesce from that. Not to be in such a big hurry to know. Because this uncertainty is a sacred gift. That if our society is going to change, it would be good for us to model uncertainty and to create the morphic field of comfort in uncertainty, because if anything's going to change, a lot of people on this planet are going to have to become less certain about what they think they know. That's for sure. So let's maybe be leaders in doing that too.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Osho quote, "Not knowing is the most intimate." And there is this kind of step that we can take from anxiety and the very real anxiety of uncertainty to a type of inward intimacy that it creates, and where something spontaneous and truly creative can arise. I've really, really appreciated that we've been able to, speak about spirit and about matters of the heart in this space. It means a lot to me. And I'm reminded of a really small poem from a Scottish poet. And it's very, very small, but for me, it just came to me as you were speaking, which is "The door to the walled garden, the place I had never been before, was opened. With a simple turn of the key I'd carried with me all these years." And there's such a kind of an underlying emphasis and assumption of struggle in activism, and at the same time holding the possibility for that simple turn of the key when we really tune into something greater than ourselves. So I want to thank everyone for joining and for giving us your time. And I feel like there's something here in having other speakers from different walks of life speaking about this kind of topic. I want to thank you, and thank to Gaurav and to Rich and the Psychedelic Society for all their work behind the scenes. And particularly to you, Charles, for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Ronan.
Right.